Excellencies, WTO representatives, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and a warm welcome to the first edition of the World Trade Congress on Gender. My name is Anouche Derbogossian, and I am the head of the WTO Trade and Gender Unit. Yes, you heard well, there is a gender unit in the WTO. I am delighted to see you all today. Oh. Yes, so please use the headphone on your desk. Good? Okay. I am delighted to see you all today in the WTO and online for the first International Research Conference on Trade and Gender. Before we engage in our various research sessions held throughout the 3 days of the Congress, we will hear the views of eminent leaders and our high-level special guests on how to build recovery through inclusive trade. After the high-level discussion, we will exchange with the 5 Congress ambassadors who will share their experience on how crises impact women, showing us that crises are actually not gender neutral. But before we go into these discussions, and without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the WTO, to take the floor to deliver her keynote speech and kick off the Congress. Thank you.
Thank you, Anoush. I think it's more like keynote remarks, not a speech. But good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. First of all, a special welcome to all the men. Because when we talk about gender, it's not just about women. A lot of the things that need to be done concern men. But I'm going off script as usual, so let me get back to my script before Anoush has a heart attack. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the World Trade Congress on Gender. This is the first international research conference of this scale on trade and gender. With women making up over half the global population, and with trade worth over half of global economic output, this should have happened a long time ago. I want to start by welcoming our fantastic panelists who will be kicking off the proceedings this morning. We're welcoming to the WTO for the first time the United Kingdom Secretary of State for International Trade and also Minister for Women and Equalities, Her Excellency Kemi Badenoch. Welcome. She'll be joined on the panel by another minister who knows these corridors very well, El Salvador's Economy Minister, Her Excellency Maria Luisa Hayem Breve. Where are you sitting? Thank you for coming all the way from El Salvador. And our very own Ms. Pamela Cook Hamilton, Executive Director of the ITC Trade Center, which leads the She Trades Initiative that has connected 3 million women to international market opportunities. Pamela, where are you? Thank you. I also want to thank and welcome Mr. Pedro Manuel Moreno, the UNCTAD Deputy Secretary General, who has been doing us really great duties by appearing at almost all our events recently. Thank you, Pedro, very much. And our very own New Zealand Ambassador Claire Kelly, who is a powerful advocate for women's economic empowerment in her own right. She will moderate the session. Where is Claire? Okay, so you see you have an outstanding panel to kick us off this morning. The WTO Congress on Gender seeks to spotlight research on how trade interacts with economic and social opportunities for women, to showcase new research initiatives, and to promote innovative work in the field of trade and gender. Our plan is for this to become a regular biannual event. But based on what I'm hearing already, we may make it more frequent. Based on the exciting agenda for these 3 days, I think we're off to a good start. And seeing how so many of you in the room is very exciting. 30 top researchers from around the world are set to present their latest findings on how global gender equality can make trade a stronger instrument for helping economies recover from the polycrisis of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, high energy and food prices, and climate change, all of which have made already wide gender gaps worse. As Anush said, crises are not gender neutral. Discussions will look at issues such as the need to increase the number of effective gender responsive provisions in trade agreements, how trade can mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on women, and how access to global value chains impacts women's empowerment. We are looking at practical, solutions-oriented work, and governments and international agencies will enrich these debates with their own perspectives and experiences. Allow me a few minutes to explain why we felt that this conference on this issue and here at the WTO was so necessary and timely. The economic and social costs of gender inequality today are enormous. Earlier this year, the World Bank estimated that 2.4 billion working age women do not have equal economic opportunities compared to men. The gap between expected lifetime earnings for men and women globally is $172 trillion. Yes, 172 trillion. That's nearly double the entire world's annual GDP. And COVID-19 has set women and girls back within education, in the home, and in the labor market. The World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report found that because of the pandemic, at current rates of progress, it would take 132 years now to reach global gender parity instead of the 99 estimated before. If we continue on this path, it will take 155 years to close the political empowerment gender gap, 151 years for the economic participation and opportunity gender gap, and 22 years for the educational attainment gender gap. So women are getting closer to men in terms of educational attainment, but that education is not factoring into power politically or economically. Very interesting. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres put it well. This is one of my favorite quotes, so let me quote it again. I cannot accept a world that tells my granddaughters that gender equality must wait for their granddaughters' granddaughters. We need to act, and we need to act now. Closing gender gaps would yield major economic returns. According to the IMF, in many developing countries, achieving gender equality in the labor market could raise GDP by as much as 35%. As I've said in earlier speeches, and I was very happy to hear someone quoted the other day, investing in women is smart economics. Investing in girls is even smarter economics. And trade is a tool to narrow gender gaps. On the consumption side, a joint study by the WTO and the World Bank looked at a sample of 54 developing countries and found that eliminating import tariffs would boost real incomes for female-headed households more than for households led by men. On the production side, trade generates more and better jobs for women. Companies that export typically employ more women, and research has found that women working in export sectors earn up to 2 times more than their counterparts in non-export sectors. They are also likelier to have a formal job with greater security and training opportunities. In emerging markets and developing countries, firms that are integrated into global value chains have an average female labor share of 37% compared to 25% for other firms. And while women tend to be overrepresented in low-skilled jobs and in the informal sector, in places like Morocco, Romania, and Vietnam, they account for 50% or more of the workforce of exporting firms. There are many ways in which trade policies can hold women back. WTO economists find that tariffs are higher on female labor-intensive goods. Female labor-intensive services sectors face greater trade restrictiveness. Trade costs associated with the need for face-to-face interaction tend to be larger in sectors where women are overrepresented. So the research that has been done some of which we'll be discussing here, is crucial because it allows us to identify the specific issues and to use practical policies to solve these issues. But there are still many holes in the data, and filling these gaps is a critical step for crafting trade and complementary policies so that they advance gender equality as effectively as possible. And this is why we're here today. So researchers can not only present their diagnostics, but come up with concrete solutions that can help women. The WTO Gender Research Hub plays a key role here. This growing network of more than 50 researchers is publicizing findings, fostering partnerships, and improving data collection methods. The Hub's Trade and Gender database stores 140 articles, books, and papers published worldwide over the last 2 years. We need to keep up this momentum. The WTO and our members are acting on other fronts as well. Beyond joint research with other international organizations, about 130 members in our informal working group on trade and gender are looking at how trade rules and associated policies can better foster women's participation in global trade. And I believe the co-chairs of the informal working group are here. Thought I saw Ambassador Atalia here. Yeah. And any other co-chairs? I can't see. Ah, our wonderful ambassador from El Salvador is also here. Well, how about the ambassador from Iceland? No? Okay. Well, could you stand up, please, so that people can see who is leading the work among the members? Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you, Ambassador Atalia, Ambassador Patricia. Thank you so much. Now, the moving online has helped many women-owned businesses connect to international markets, and a group of WTO members are working to set out some basic global rules for digital trade. Here we have to specifically look to see how women can benefit from these rules. On the supply side, a Standards and Trade Development Facility just announced that it would work to better understand the gender impacts of health and safety standards in the agri-food sector and how compliance with these standards can create opportunities for women. Still on the supply side, our sister organization, the ITC, has worked concretely and practically to help millions of women connect to regional and global markets and to double their income. I'm sure Pamela will have a lot more to say about this. In sum, we're moving in the right direction, but we have a long way to go, and we need good research to show us the way. Before I stop here so you can listen to the experts, I want to thank the WTO Trade and Gender Unit, especially Anush and her team, Nicole, my gender advisor, and not just for their work for this conference, but for all that they do to highlight how trade is working or isn't working for women. I want to thank all the WTO staff who have shown tremendous interest in getting the work on women in trade going, and even the work for a gender policy within the organization going. So thank you all for taking part in this conversation. And now I'll let you listen to those who have more to say than I do. Thank you.
Thank you, Director General, for these insightful words. So now I would like to invite our special and distinguished guests to step on the podium for the opening panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Director General, and thank you, Anush, for bringing us here today and convening this wonderful event. It's a real honour for me to moderate this high-level opening of the first World Trade Congress on Gender. And as you've heard from the DG, we're absolutely privileged with an exceptional panel this morning. The way that we're going to format our discussion is to have a response from each of the panelists to an initial question and then get into more detail with them in further questions. The first question that we have today is, in the current global context, what is your definition of sustainable trade and how can we achieve it? And I would like to invite the Right Honourable Kemi Badenoch, Secretary of State for International Trade and Minister for Women and Equalities of the UK, to respond first, followed by Minister Maria Luisa Hayem, Minister of Economy of El Salvador and former WTO delegate, very familiar with this room, to respond first. Thank you, Minister. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And I'll start off by saying what a pleasure it is to be here. I've been the Secretary of State for International Trade for just under 3 months. And I think this is actually a groundbreaking conference. So thank you to WTO and to Ngozi in particular for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to set out my stall. And I hope that this certainly will be something that we see more frequently going forwards as well. So the question was around my definition of sustainable trade and how we can achieve it. And whenever I get a question like that, I start off by asking, what exactly is it that we mean by sustainable? It's very easy for all of us to assume we're talking about the same thing. And when I talk about sustainability, I'm talking about thinking about the future. What are we handing over to the next generation? What is it that we're doing that makes sure that whatever legacy we pass down is better than the one that we as a generation inherited? And thinking about that in the context of trade. So how can we make sure that trade is better for the future? That we're not just thinking about today, but thinking about tomorrow. What are we doing that's going to make sure that all of our activities are improved? And one of the key things that we look at within trade is looking at how it creates jobs, leads to greater economic diversification, innovation, and poverty reduction, all of which have a direct impact on gender, which is the topic that we're talking about today. So from the UK's perspective, we are obviously committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, including SDG 5 on gender equality. We're also committed to the transition to net zero. And for me, sustainable trade looks at both of those two issues in a combined way. We have to unlock economic growth and job creation that trade offers, whilst ensuring that we're doing as much as we can for women and girls and meeting our climate goals. It's about making sure that everybody has access to the benefits of trade. There are some fantastic statistics, or rather I should say fantastic in the fact that we know them. They're not great statistics around what we're doing for women. According to the UN, women make up half the world's population, but only contribute 37% of global GDP. You would have heard the Director General giving lots more facts and statistics about how well women are or are not doing around the world. Obviously, some countries are doing better than others. In my view, sustainability is about thinking broadly about what we can do, not just in places like Switzerland or in the UK, but how our activities impact places around the world. We do want to increase the number of women in the labor markets. We do want to see an increase in productivity and GDP. So we are leading the way, by example, in negotiating standalone trade and gender equality chapters in our free trade agreements. That's an example of what we're doing. We know that those free trade agreements are going to last for many decades, or many years into the future. So for example, with Australia and New Zealand, we had gender chapters and also environment chapters, which are groundbreaking. These are not things that you typically see in the FTAs. And we were able to get Australia to actually put in one on the environment, which is not one that they had done in any of their previous FTAs. So we're using our influence to encourage other countries to come along on this journey in terms of making the world a better place for everyone, in particular women and girls who have had a pretty rough deal so far. And we also have several programs which we doing our foreign Commonwealth Office promotes the She Trades Commonwealth Programme, which is a UK-led trade and gender initiative, which aims to increase economic growth and job creation in Commonwealth countries. And what it does is it is increasing participation of women-owned businesses in international trade and improving access to export opportunities. We also have She Trades Outlook, which has helped developing countries collect data and best practices on trade policy that affects women entrepreneurs and their businesses, which enables that systemic information sharing that allows us to get the evidence which shows what the statistics are. If we don't know what's going on, then we cannot tailor the policy in the right way in order to improve lives for people. And I'm very pleased to say that to date, 32 Commonwealth countries have completed their national information in the She Trades Outlook Global Database. And those are some of the examples of how we are thinking about the future, but also bringing more countries more broadly, sharing into these sorts of practices, sharing best practice globally in order to improve lives and also demonstrate sustainable trade, not just in words, but in action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Turning now to Minister Hayem, your views on sustainable trade and how we achieve it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Kelly. It's a real honor, and I'm actually very excited to be here at the WTO, the place where I actually started my career, my professional career 20 years ago. And I'm very excited to be here after 20 years after, but also several international organizations after. I've been working in the international development world for the past 20 years, and I'm now giving back to my country and an area that I'm working and we're trying to promote that equality is in the gender front. Not looking at gender as a separate agenda, but basically having gender be part of everything that we do. And I think that's an approach that we should be taking not as a separate topic, but something that should be inherent in everything that we do, and in the analysis of the projects that we implement. Turning to Ambassador Kelly's question, we see sustainable trade from two perspectives and linked, of course. One is sustainable trade from the perspective of how what we do, government do, and what companies do is in harmony with the environment. And the other perspective is the sustainability in time, how we create the conditions so that the trade that we're seeing today is a trade that's going to continue in the future, but it's a trade that's going to be high. It's an increased trade that we're hoping to see in the future, and it's a trade that it's going to more and more see the role of women being part of it. So how to achieve these two, I don't want to say different sustainable trades because we're talking about the same thing, but how do we achieve a trade that's sustainable and that protects our environment? And here the government has a role to play, but also companies have a huge role to play. And we're happy to see in the case of El Salvador, where more and more we're seeing good practices in order to protect our environment, including a better use of water, including a recycling process, for instance, in the plastic sector. So this is something that it's fortunately happened, but we need to strengthen, and we need to make it horizontal in all sectors to make sure that the future that we leave for future generations, it's a good future. In terms of the role of the government, the example of El Salvador that I would want to share this morning with you all is we have made a partnership with the IFC, the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank, in order to promote certifications of clean production so that companies can adopt the machinery that they need, that it's going to produce in a friendly in a way that it's friendly with the environment. We have created, we're soon to launch our committee for clean production, where different ministries are also part of it. And we have already developed two standards or guidelines for companies to adopt. So in the case of the sustainable trade that it's consistent and in harmony with the environment, we see the role, of course, of the government, companies, but also international organizations. In terms of how we're going to achieve that sustainable trade in time, and I think that's very important, because we need to be proactive and we need to be prepared for what's going to happen next. COVID pandemic was pretty blunt and left many messages and learnings on how things can change from one day to another. And in this sense, the more we have legal certainty in our countries, the more we have strong legal frameworks. The trade facilitation, investment facilitation has to be in place in order to make sure that the trade that we see in the future is a sustainable trade. Again, with the incorporation of women as in an equal manner as men, and we'll talk more about this. But we also see the international organizations being part of this process, and a big responsibility, not only by creating the legal frameworks that we need, but also in implementing them, in providing the technical assistance and the financing specifically for developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you to both ministers. There's some really inspiring policy responses to current challenges in what you're progressing. Turning now to international institutions, can I hand over to Pedro Manuel Moreno to give us his view on sustainable development?
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you for having us here. This is really a great initiative. I hope that the 2 years period that we are aiming for can be reduced to every year, because really this is a great initiative. We are so happy to be part of it and to to continue developing this. I don't think that I can elaborate much more on the definition of sustainable trade, because I think it's like very much said by the other experts. I liked a lot what you, Minister, said about the having in mind the future and what we are leaving our future generations, including the social, the economic, and the environmental aspects of sustainability. So I would go more on the how can we achieve this sustainable trade, and I would say that all in all, we would say that we need to make trade more inclusive, greener, and of a greater economic value that is shared more equally. To make trade more inclusive, I would say that to some extent this has happened as developing countries could increase their share in global trade over the last decades, but this share has been shared unequally and unevenly. Actually, not in all regions trade has increased, and for example in Latin America or in Africa, the share of global trade has even decreased since UNCTAD was created in 1964. For the least developed countries, their share has hardly moved despite the commitment of the international community to double that share. We also need to make trade greener, which also means that way trade will be also sustainable. A promising avenue is biotrade, for example, that is a trade that respects people and nature, and though this is still a very niche product, it is growing fast. Biotrade goods increased from $40 million in 2003 to $10.2 billion in 2020. Climate change is also changing the patterns of what countries can produce, can trade, and can consume. And this implies that countries need to adapt also and enhance their trade climate readiness. In many developing countries, key sectors of the economy are affected by climate change. And for instance, agriculture, fisheries, and tourism constitute about 17% of exports of developing countries. For seeds, this figure goes up to 35%. And lastly, trade needs to generate more economic value that is going to be shared more equally. The value of international trade has grown rapidly over the last decades, from $4 to $3.3 trillion in 1990 to $28.3 trillion in 2021, almost 7 times more. As the vast majority of trade happens through global value chains, participation in these global value chains is critical to benefit from trade, especially for women. Also, the ability to adapt to how trade is changing is important, such as the digitalization of trade, where we also see a huge gap on women's access and participation. There are many policies and tools that can foster sustainable trade as well. For instance, the voluntary sustainability standards that can help align trade with various aspects of sustainability, such as better employment conditions, climate change, biodiversity, or human rights. So I would say these 3 dimensions we should look at very carefully on the development of this Congress. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you. And the final word on sustainable trade and how we can achieve it goes to Pamela Cook-Hamilton, Executive Director of ITC.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. It's always hard when you come last. I mean, what am I supposed to say now? But I think I agree with everything that has been said so far. When I was thinking about the concept of sustainable trade and what does it mean, for me, I'm coming from a developing country. For me, sustainable trade literally is how does trade serve the interest of those who are underserved, those most vulnerable. If it doesn't do that, it's not sustainable. And I think we need to get to the practical version of what is sustainable trade. And therefore, we need what I call a comprehensive, all-encompassing approach to reducing poverty and to increasing access for those who do not have it at this stage and those who are in the most vulnerable positions. So agreeing with what has been said about it being inclusive and resilient, because it can be inclusive but not resilient. And I think both go together. One of the things that we've seen over the last 2 years in terms of women's, how they have been disproportionately affected by COVID, has kind of just put in very stark relief what lack of inclusion has done and how quickly gains can be undone in a simple 2-year period. And therefore, to ensure that it is more embedded, that it actually can be maintained and sustained, we have to be more proactive and deliberate about putting in place women's policies that help women in international trade, policies that enable women to access finance, policies that actually support the inclusion of women in global value chains and so on. And so one of the things that we do at ITC, and I really want to thank Minister Badenoch for her nice, I think we should, did anybody tape that? Because we want to use it for our, for our future propaganda. But thank you so much for that. I think one of the things what we've been very fortunate is to have the support of many donors on the She Trades program. And the Commonwealth She Trades program has been one of the best performing programs that we've had, and we're very grateful for that. Thank you. And the She Trades Outlook, as it has already been adopted by, I think, 46 countries, but 38 Commonwealth countries, is one of those measures that is very important in terms of ensuring that policy frameworks are embedded in government policy for women. Because once you have that, it's very hard to take it back out. And so the She Trades Outlook allows you to measure, to assess, and then to implement. And that's a very important tool. I also want to say it's important to build competitiveness for women across the value chain. And this includes the digitalization. One of the things that was clear during COVID was how impactful going digital was for women businesses. Those who were able to make that transition quickly were actually able to survive and thrive. Those who were not went under. And so the importance of having digital access, connectivity for women is going to be even more critical as we move towards more e-commerce, more online marketing, and all the other measures that are now being affected by the digital framework. Another area is government, well, not just government procurement across the board, because I've raised it even in the context of the UN system, that the UN is probably one of the largest procurers in the world, given its breadth. And there is no built-in system for women procurement. And I kind of wonder why. But I'm just asking. But the point is that there needs to be embedded in not just governments, but international institutions, a kind of carve out that says women get 20% access, whatever it is, but it allows you to have an embedded framework that women can definitely have access to without having to join the melee of competition and also those who've been used to it. Finally, what I'd say is that women are naturally at a disadvantage with respect to the issue of access to finance. This is a huge issue. And the reasons for that are multiple. But of course, we know there's cultural, there's collateral issues, there's the fact that some women don't even have ownership of their own property. Well, their husband's property. Um, and there are many situations, as we know. So how do we enable women to have access to finance in a way that is affordable, that gives them the ability to invest in their businesses, but also gives them the ability to access value chains along which they can become more profitable? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you both for landing us in a very good position to move on to our more detailed questions with each of our speakers. I'm going to start again with Minister Badenoch and ask you a two-part question, Minister. Firstly, how do you think data and research can support gender-responsive policy making? And then to highlight the WTO specifically, what would you see as a good outcome on gender equality at the 13th Ministerial Conference?
Okay.
Thank you.
Is that better? Yes. Thank you, Your Excellency. Those are two very good questions. And I think, again, I would start by looking at what the purpose of the data and research we're collecting is for. It's to inform the decision-making, inform our policy-making. As I made, as I said earlier in my earlier comment, that if we don't know what's going on, then we can't have the right policy to tackle the issue. So, as an example, during COVID-19, one of the things that we discovered as we were looking at the data that was coming out was that women were more likely to be furloughed from the jobs that they had, more likely to work in the services sector, but also men were more likely to be made redundant from their jobs. And that the jobs that women had in the services sectors more impacted. However, the public sector, health and education, people were not furloughed, people were not made redundant. And so making sure that we get a whole picture of what's going on. I think one of the difficulties we have in this space is that when we're talking about gender and women, we start to almost assume that we are in isolation, that there's a place where there's some women doing some things and a separate place where there's some men doing some other things. Women are mothers to boys, they are daughters looking after fathers, men are fathers to daughters, we're spouses to each other. So we like to think about it in terms of not just individuals, but also families, and knowing what's happening to each gender also shows what's happening with families. So for example, knowing that women were much more likely to have to go to work has an impact on what you're doing with schools. What are we doing on childcare? Schools being open has an impact. So you have to factor that into the decision making around whether to open schools or not. What's going to happen to the children? We know that women are more likely to be carers, and if we're expecting them to go out to do more within the health sector or to do the teaching, what kind of impact is that going to have? So all of it feeds in, all of the information that if you're a woman working in the health sector and your husband has just lost his job, that's going to be a very, and you have children that are at school, that's going to be a very difficult circumstance from just one woman who's going to work and is being paid to stay at home. So looking at the multi-factors that are affecting women's lives is absolutely key. So the data that we have about employment ratios of men and women in sectors, as well as on the size of their business, also has an impact on, we talked about COVID policy, but on trade. So the impact of imports and exports on the UK's labour market, we are measuring by sector, by region, and by personal characteristics, including gender. So I'm the Minister for Women and Equalities, not just the Minister for Women. So we look at things even through the lens of race. We look at things through the lens of religion and age and all of those things, because they're all factors that make a difference in people's lives. So our estimates suggest that men currently are in exporting activity disproportionately. So of all the full-time jobs that directly and are indirectly supported by exports, 40% are held by women and 60% are held by men. And we also have evidence that women-led businesses benefit more from the trade policy measures than men-led businesses, because they are smaller and because they are younger. So what this tells us is that we can adapt our trade policy to get greater gains. We can generate more gains by targeting support to those types of businesses, and that does lead to economic growth and to job creation. And we have existing international commitments to data and research that will help us to further increase our understanding of those current challenges and actions we can take, and they were captured in the 11th Ministerial Conference declaration. So we want all countries to increase their data collection analysis and adapt their policy work accordingly to maximize trading opportunities across economies. But one of the things that I think that does need more focus is on transparency. Transparency is a very key aspect. It's not just producing data, but showing how we're producing the data, making sure that all of the data we're using is consistent. If we're using different metrics or different definitions, and the data that's coming out is not clean. I say this as an engineer. I'm very, very obsessed about clean data and good data, not just data. We need to make sure we're not just churning out information, but that what we are churning out is useful. So as an example, one of the things that we do in the UK is gender pay gap reporting. And many people don't understand what gender pay gap reporting is. They think it's just looking at whether men are being paid more than women. But it's about looking at the makeup of your workforce. Which jobs are people doing? You can have loads of women and one man who's at the top. That impacts what the gender pay gap is. You can have one woman at the top and running a business made up of men. It changes what the statistics are. But the key thing about gender pay gap reporting is that it forces businesses to think about what they are doing. And this is what looking at things through a gender lens means. It doesn't just mean putting the word gender inside the existing statement that you had. It means thinking genuinely about what are we doing? How does this impact the lives of women? And that's what a meaningful way of using data and research can produce. And we have seen the gap close. And it's not because the government is chasing down the companies that have large gender pay gaps, but it's also because many companies didn't realize this about themselves, because it's very granular, very specific data. And we publish this data, and that's what transparency can do. And your second question was on what would be a good outcome at the 13th Ministerial Conference. So hopefully I'll still be in post then, and then we can see how well we have done over the last 2 years. You never know. But the UK is a strong supporter of that joint declaration, as I mentioned, and the commitments are still relevant. They require collect the data that I've just been talking about, but also to share best practice. So it's not just about one country doing things well and then congratulating. If it's just one country doing it, then that means that the rest of the world is not improving. So we have to share best practice as much as possible and work together to remove those barriers and support the participation of women in trade, which is what this conference is about. It's not just doing things for women in general, but in every single aspect. And I, as the Trade Secretary, will be looking at that in trade. So I'm very pleased with the recognition in the 12th declaration, 12th Ministerial Conference declaration outcome document of the importance of women's economic empowerment as part of the inclusive and the sustainable growth that we've been talking about. Even if global events sometimes make things difficult, I know we didn't get a full multilateral declaration. Russia and Ukraine was taking place at the time, and we can see the impact that war has had on women. We can see the impact that has had on Ukraine in terms of their exports. Those will be lots of businesses, lots of sectors that are employing women. We have had a huge influx across Europe in terms of refugees. We know that primarily they have been women and children, and all of this will be showing workforce depletion, sector depletion, and people who may find it harder to go back into work. There's a lot of work that we're trying to do in the UK in terms of infrastructure redevelopment and building back better for Ukraine. So those are some of the things which I hope when we're having the 13th ministerial declaration, we will have some good news there. And I know that we'll continue to make progress through the multilateral trading system. So at the next conference, we'll be pressing for an ambitious declaration on this issue, recognizing the barriers to trade for women and how we can overcome them. And this should commit all of us to better understand the impact that trade has on women and men across the work of the WTO and its committees. Will progress research and analysis and recognize that barriers come from a range of issues, including the lifestyles that women have, often in terms of unpaid care and domestic work, which we have to undertake. So I know that the title of the near final draft for that last conference was Joint Ministerial Declaration on the Advancement of Gender Equality and Women's Economic Empowerment within Trade. I hope next time could be shorter, because that was very long, and that we can have something which the rest of the world can see that at the WTO things actually happen. It's not just talking, but that we are having meaningful change and lots of good action. And I'm looking forward to working with the Director General in order to achieve that. So that's what I hope will be the outcome for the next conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. You've set us some very clear objectives there. Moving on to Minister Hayam, another two-part question. Could you tell us whether you would say that women are at the core of economic recovery and why? And where do you see the role of the WTO in building a gender-responsive recovery? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I think El Salvador, or the participation of women in El Salvador, has been clear and has been key, especially since the past 3 years and a half, I would say. It was in June 2019 when the new government decided to have a parity in the cabinet of ministers. So we started the government, this administration, the administration of President Bukele started in June 2019, preparing for what was coming next, the pandemic that got to El Salvador in early 2020. So the fact that there was equal amount of women and men leading the different agencies that were key in going through the pandemic and solving all the issues that came with the pandemic was important. And El Salvador is now recognized as being one of the countries that better managed the pandemic in terms of the actions that were taken in a proactive manner, but also in terms of vaccinations that were able to have a large coverage of different doses in a short period of time. So the role of women in the government was key in the not only in the health front, but also in the economic side of things. We're able to implement one of the biggest projects in order to provide financing to companies that if they wouldn't have received this financing, they wouldn't have survived the pandemic. But also we have seen very interesting, I would say, situations happening in El Salvador. And just a little bit on data, since August 2020, when the economic restrictions were eliminated, and our economy started boosting up until now, where El Salvador is showing the best indicators in terms of its economy. And we can see that from August 2020 to September 22, we have seen more than 50,000 employments being created for women. If we compare this with men, this is a larger proportion, and we see a 21% increase of women hires compared to men that have increased 18%. So this is something that it sends very, very clear signals. Women are being more and more part of the economy. But also talking about trade facilitation, which is one of the topics that I have very close to my heart. El Salvador has been positioned in the UNCTAD, in a recent UNCTAD indicator about trade facilitation sustainability. It has been El Salvador has been positioned in a very high level compared to other Latin American countries. And one of the reasons why this is happening is because of the participation of women in our national committee. We have seven representatives of the private sector, of private sector associations, and 4 of them are women. And of course, leading government agencies also, there's a significant amount of women also leading government institutions. But leaving aside an indicator, which for us is very important because we're positioned in El Salvador, thanks to the work that we have been doing in this Trade Facilitation Committee, last year, El Salvador, it had contributed to this economic growth that we're seeing. And El Salvador last year had an economic growth of 10.3%. Our exports are above 30% increase compared to 2020. And of course, 2020 was a year, not typical year, but still we keep seeing this trend where exports are increasing, investments are increasing, imports that are very important for our production, local production for exports are also are also increasing. So we're seeing these good indicators on what's happening in our economy, but at the same time, we're seeing more participation of women in the labor force and also more participation of women in leading positions within the government, but also the private sector. Also, something very interesting and that helped us go through the pandemic was the fact that companies had the ability to reconvert very easily or easily, very fast. Maybe it was difficult for companies, but because of the resiliency and the entrepreneurship spirit, El Salvador was one of the countries, for instance, that was able to export equipment to address the pandemic to countries like the U.S. Medical equipment that was used to address this situation and to a country that has high standards. So, and I mentioned the textile sector because again, women has a very important role in the textile sector. So again, women shows up as being part of this recovery. Also, we saw a lot of new entrepreneurships and new entrepreneurs popping up in order to be able to go through the pandemic. And again, women were largely leading these new businesses that came up during pandemic. We're seeing the creation more and more the creation of online platforms in order for women to sell locally and exports. And just to give you an example, one that we're working recently, there's 55 entrepreneurs that participate in this online platform, again selling mainly locally, but now trying to export. And 52 of these entrepreneurships are led by women. So it's very clear that in El Salvador, from what we're seeing in our data, we're seeing, and in our experience, daily experience, we're seeing more and more leadership of women. So to respond to Ambassador Kelly's question, we definitely see that women has been in the core of economic recovery in El Salvador. Again, we're seeing the best indicators in our economy that we've never seen in the past, and women had a very important role in this recovery. And we see that women more and more will keep having a very important role to play and a contribution to play in this sustainable trade and this sustainable growth that I was mentioning earlier. In terms of what's the role of WTO in order to keep promoting these good news that I've shared, we definitely think that keep developing these frameworks, legal frameworks, like the trade facilitation agreement, like the services, in terms of services facilitation, also the recently domestic regulation agreement that was adopted. All these things will promote an economic development where women will have a role to play. But also from El Salvador, we do think that having for instance, preferences, trade preferences, in order to promote development, hasn't been there hasn't been a direct link between the preferences and the agreements that we sign. Not necessarily they become a development tool. And here is where we believe that there has to be joint efforts from international organizations and also local governments in order to make sure that there are these plans in order to take advantage of this legal framework. And in the case of El Salvador, we have developed we have preferences with more than 40 countries around the world, but unfortunately, having a legal agreement was not necessarily what translated to more trade and more opportunities. So implementing complementary actions like these plans, where we identify what are those products that are maybe the key or star products, like I call them, that can go to the destination country and work together to make sure that the countries have the capacity in terms of having the right certification, having the right machinery in order to reach the scale they need, and working with these companies to make sure that there are no barriers in the exports of these products, linking them with buyers. I think that there's a lot that we can do, like I say, to help the invisible hand do its job. I think if it's a matter of putting the dots together, it's not to do the work of the private sector in any way, shape, or form, but we believe that a part of the legal frameworks, which are very important and we need, there's also we need to all work together in order to make sure that we all take advantage of these legal frameworks. Also projects, currently we're designing a project with one of the largest courier companies in the world in order to provide the tools for, in this specific case, for women to be able to export and be able to sell their goods and not have these huge costs in order to export goods. I was talking to an entrepreneur recently. She was saying that the cost of sending the good is the double of what the good costs, right? So if we don't come all to the table and bring and all contribute, meaning private sector, government, international organizations, academia, civil society, that's the only way we see that all the work that we do at WTO and all the work that we do within our free trade agreements is going to translate in more opportunities for women and men. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for those fascinating insights. Moving on now to perspectives from our expert international organisations in Geneva, I'm going to start again with our UNCTAD Deputy Director General. Deputy Director General Moreno, how would you assess the impact of crises on women? And what do you see as the role of trade policy in accelerating post-conflict recovery for women's benefit?
Thank you, Ambassador. It's very interesting, this question, because we all know that crises are not gender neutral. We all know that. And yet every crisis we assess the impact of women and say, women and girls are disproportionately affected, and we still don't have, a new crisis comes and we still don't have the protection measures and the policies in place to avoid the impact that we already know that is going to cause on women and girls. So, and they are not gender neutrals for reasons. First, the access to a labor market and the labor market participation. We all know that there are more women in the informal sector, meaning that they will have less protection system and their jobs will be more likely to be cut in times of spending cuts. The second reason is the access to finance. Women have less access to finance, meaning that their businesses, don't have the liquidity to prosper and to function and to survive. 3, in crisis, we all know also that girls are at a higher risk to be taken out of school, be for compensate for income loss or for take up care responsibilities. And this, which is a very concrete effect, has really negative long-term effects, as we all know. And 4 crises are associated with an increase in gender-based violence, which is actually a very worrying and hidden phase of the crisis. And the recent COVID and the cost of living crisis, Ambassador, are no exception of this. We have some data proving that during the pandemic, for example, around 4.2% of women and 3% of men lost their jobs, according to ILO. Many women left the labor market altogether as they took up a disproportionate share of care responsibilities, which resulted in a big reversal on the gains, hard-won gains on gender equality that we had achieved before. As you all know, UNCTAD coordinates the work of the Global Crisis Response Group on Fuel, Food and Finance, tasked by the UN Secretary General. And we have also studied the impact of women and girls of this crisis. And the work showed also that gender gaps widened, especially by increasing women and girls' rates of food insecurity, malnutrition, and energy poverty. What is important is that recovery policies, of course, are gender sensitive, that we have some preset measures in place to preclude some of the negative effects of the crisis that we all know that will happen. And that links to the second part of your question, Ambassador. What is the role of trade policy in accelerating post-conflict recovery for women's benefit? As we all know, trade plays an important role for recovery because the food, fertilizer, and energy crisis, or the COVID crisis that we mentioned before, have been clear reminders of this and how important global supply chains are for our societies to function and prosper. They can collapse basically everything related to trade. Well, but we do not only need trade to recover, we need to make trade more inclusive. And this means that we need to broaden the number of winners, which in turn means that we need to ensure that trade includes and benefits more women and that the distributional effects of trade are fairer. I want to share 4 concrete examples on how trade or trade-related policy can foster more inclusive outcomes, especially for women, very brief. My first example relates to trade agreements and thus trade policy making. Having here 2 prominent ministers, I think that they will this will resonate with them as well, because they are champions of this. There is increasing visibility and recognition of gender issues in trade agreements. We must admit that. While the 2016 free trade agreement between Chile and Uruguay was the first FTA to include a gender chapter, today more than 80 regional and bilateral trade agreements include at least one provision mentioning explicitly gender or women. The way gender perspective has been incorporated differs from one agreement to another, but I think it's a good way and it's a good path that we have opened. My second example is on how gender policies and practices of multinational enterprises affect gender equality in host countries. As the vast majority of trade happens through multinationals, this channel matters a lot, and we need also to focus specifically on this one. Our research showed that multinational enterprises affect gender equality in host countries directly through employment practices in foreign affiliates, such as non-discrimination policies for equality in hiring practices. There is also an indirect effect through spillovers to local labor markets. In fact, our case studies from Africa, Asia, and Latin America are the first to present empirical evidence on the indirect spillover effects to local firms and labor markets. We can make the studies available to you later. The third example relates to the challenge and opportunities of digitalization and technological advances, and the extent to which women can seize these opportunities or face constraints. We have investigated which countries and within countries, which segments of the population have been able to benefit from digitalization. For instance, in India, farmers can turn on water pumps remotely thanks to remote controls on mobile phones. Not only does this help farmers to use water more efficiently, it also saves time to go and turn on pumps and reduces risks, especially for women. In your first question to the panel, I briefly mentioned the voluntary sustainability standards. VSS. VSS have the potential to improve employment conditions, for example, by requiring compliance with equal wage criteria in order to receive certification. This can be particularly beneficial to women workers who are disproportionately crowded into casual and temporary jobs, where lower wages and precarious conditions are more common. At the WTO, some remarkable steps have been taken on women in trade. At MC11 in Buenos Aires in 2017, for the first time, gender equality issues were discussed at a high-level meeting dealing with trade policy. This resulted in the Joint Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment. Also, setting up the informal working group on trade and gender in 2021 was another important step, as it is today, as I said at the beginning, this first World Trade Congress on Gender. The Congress provides a useful space to discuss and to reflect on how trade policies can be a tool to close gender gaps. In closing, today the saying trade is gender neutral has been overcome. But we still have a long journey to go. It remains a fact that women and men do not face the same conditions in which they participate in and benefit from trade. We need a better understanding of the relations between labor and capital, industrialization and gender, or gender and trade from a macro perspective. Gender work should also be more cognizant of power structures and the different roles women and men play as producers, consumers, and decision makers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those insights. And moving on to Pamela, how do you see the role of ITC in mitigating the impact of crises on women? And following on from that, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is still very vivid, especially for women. And how do you see the role of women and female entrepreneurs in building back better post-crisis? Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, let me start with the second question first, because I think it leads to what ITC is doing. I think the first thing I need to say is that, the Harvard Business Review, McKinsey, and also the Boston Consulting Group all have produced studies that have shown that including more women in their businesses has actually increased their bottom line, has increased their productivity and their growth. And therefore, it means that building back better must, by extension, include women. Because if you really want to improve your bottom line, if you want to increase your growth, then it would seem purely common sense that you would include a full gender equality in what you do. Now, one of the things that we found over the last 2 years is women often work or own businesses that support their families, and they make household income decisions. So when women gain, the society gains, the community gains. And we've seen this so often, especially in our work in Africa, where we have been able to work with one woman who was able to put in solar panels in 60 homes, bringing 9,000 people getting electricity for the first time. And as a result, and that's just $250,000 to one woman. And that's the part of leveraging that we think is important, because women tend to always focus on around them as opposed to just the bottom line. They look at how do they empower others. We also find that, when we employ more women in leadership, it actually not only helps the business, but it also tends to have a knock-on effect to employing more younger women. And I think the issue of younger women and mentoring is also very important and tends to be overlooked. One of the things that I've always wondered about is, why don't we also work more with girls? And so one of the things we are looking at is having a She Trades Girls program, which will actually then begin, before you get to being a woman. I mean, it tends to happen as a natural knock-on. But we keep pulling people out of the river at the bottom. And as Desmond Tutu said, why don't we find out why they're falling in? And so I had a very insightful discussion with the president of Niger last week in Niamey. And he was saying how concerned he was about the fact that girls are getting married and having children from 14. And by the time they're 20, they have 4. And so how do we intervene before that? How do we ensure that girls are not already sidelined by the time they get to 22 and therefore try to fix the problem after the fact? So that's one of the important things. I think we have to look at the opportunities that have been presented. The changing consumer demand, as Pedro talked about the VSS and sustainability standards. This is going to be very important as we move through in the future. And so women need to also become more aware of what will be needed to meet standards, what will be needed to meet the new consumer demands for sustainable development and sustainability. What are the opportunities in the value chains that have been created? Digitalization also very important in terms of business for women, and we've been working with a lot of women, especially through the She Trades program, on going online, on linking to companies like Amazon, like Etsy, these online platforms that can actually expand their access to markets. And we also need to look at supply chain diversification. What we found is a lot more women, because of nearshoring, are able to now offer work in areas where they wouldn't normally have been able to, and that it offers opportunities in a domestic market that didn't exist before. And so how do we look at how the COVID crisis has actually impacted changes in trade and supply chain diversification? So building back better, I think a couple of the things that we need to look at is, one, ensuring that we are including women in the public procurement process. We're talking about women having less than 1% of the public procurement market, which is a $15 to $20 trillion market. It doesn't make any sense. And so we need to talk about that. We need to also talk about how, we not only promote increased access to the internet, because access is one thing, affordability is another. And we keep talking about connectivity and affordability as if it just happens because, no. We need to look at how practically do we get women actually connected? Do we need to set up systems using green methodology? I saw something at COP about 3 weeks ago, that basically has these containers. And I know we have containers in the Caribbean by the millions because we import everything. But that's another story. The point is that you have these containers that have been set up that actually have both wind and solar energy that actually then produce internet capacity for connectivity. And it's not expensive, it is user friendly, and it works with the environment within which they exist. And so I think these are the kinds of things that we need to look at. The other thing is partnerships. What we're doing here today is a typical example of the kind of partnerships that we need to look at. How does WTO, ITC, UNCTAD, WIPO, ITU, other organizations, how do we all pull together with our different strengths to ensure that we are serving the needs of women and women's economic empowerment? Pedro mentioned trade agreements. I think while I'm all for trade agreements, one of the biggest challenges I have with trade agreements, having negotiated several of them, is that unless they're translated into practical, applicable, they're just nice pieces of paper that trade policy wonks like us like. But when it comes to the real world, is it applicable? So we have to have that mechanism that translates from the inclusion to the actual application in the real world. And I think that is important. On the role of ITC, as I've said, we've not just only done the She Trades initiative, the She Trades Outlook, we're also looking at ensuring that we have mechanisms that also try to address the access to finance gap, because that is a huge, huge problem that we found. As much as women have become more internet savvy and more connected and more, able to access markets, they need that bridging mechanism, that bridge funding that will help them make that first step. And that is still sorely missing. It's much harder for women to access. I always tell the story of, when I went to the bank to get a mortgage, they asked me where my husband was. I mean, in this, seriously? No, what I'm saying, and if they ask me that, can you imagine what they ask a small entrepreneur who just has, an idea and wants to do something? So I think there's still these challenges that women face. And one of the things that we're trying to do is how do we practically enable women to have access to finance through different modalities and different mechanisms, by partnering with each other and by looking at the options that are out there. We also continue to support women with direct policy work with governments. How do we help them adopt things like She Trades Outlook and so on? And I think at the end of the day, it is ensuring that we are deliberate. And I keep using that word deliberate because it won't happen by accident. It has to be deliberate, it has to be tailored, it has to be direct, and it has to be intentional. And that's how we hope to continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Deliberate, tailored, and direct. Those are words to live by, I think. We have 5 minutes before we need to wrap up. So I'd like to provide a very short opportunity to any of you or all of you for one final thought or takeaway. And I could turn to you first, Pamela, if you'd like, or...
Yeah, I'm so used to being last that I kind of,
I thought I'd reverse things, shake it up a
it's
bit.
me first. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for this opportunity. I think it's always important, especially in a Congress like this, that we bring together all the potential partners in the arena of international trade. ITC stands ready to continue to work with the WTO, UNCTAD, and as I said, all the other WIPO, ITU, and so on, to basically create a system for women entrepreneurship and women's economic empowerment that surpasses and the sum of its parts. So that's thanks.
Minister, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think I'm an optimistic person, so I'm sure we have a bright future ahead, but that bright future will depend on how much we address the root causes of this disparity. And I think a lot of the work in the future has to be put on that. We can have the best free trade agreements, the best legal frameworks. By the way, we're very happy that we're working on our investment facilitation agreement, that we're already working within El Salvador to make sure that we have the best conditions for investment. But aside of that, and all the projects that I've mentioned that we have shared here, we need to do a big work still on what happens in households, in families, how girls and boys are raised has a lot to do. Myself, I come from a Latin American country where I was used that pink is for girls, light blue is for boys, and we have to start creating that equality within our households at an early stage. That's one of the things that I believe will be core, and of course in schools also this need to happen. Also, I believe women, we have a huge role in order to be examples for other women and support other women in order to achieve higher goals that maybe other women think they cannot achieve. Mentoring programs, I'm passionate for mentoring. I think it's a super powerful tool. And when I talk about mentoring, I don't see only women mentoring women. I think it's actually a great idea that men would be mentoring women too, so that we also learn from the way of thinking of men. I think that's again a powerful tool in order to bring women up to the same level as men in terms of the participation in the economy. Also, I don't know if men has this critical voice talking to your brain like a lot of women we do have, and I think stop listening and put on mute that critical voice of you cannot do it, that's too hard, I cannot apply to this job. I think that critical voice should be muted, and women should be able to take risks as men do, more than women most of the time, unfortunately. And I think that's also critical and basic. As Director General mentioned, bringing men to the conversation, it's key. This cannot be a conversation that only women can have. So looking at the future, I hope, and I'm being optimistic that we will not have to need to have the conversation that we're having these days. This is a conversation that we shouldn't be having right now. This is something that should have been solved in the past. So looking at the future, we hope that we can all work together in order to bring this issue out of the table. It has to be just normal to have women and men in the same place. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Badenoch, any final reflection?
Thank you, Your Excellency. I do, and it goes back to the first question which you asked about sustainability, and just having listened to all the comments from the fellow panelists, and reminding ourselves of what I said sustainability was, which was preparing for the future. But I think some of that also means anticipating difficulty, and we all know that we have these agreements, but as Pamela was saying, but domestic priorities will always get in the way. Unexpected events will always happen. This time last year, nobody was even thinking about Russia and Ukraine escalating to the state that it had been. So we need frameworks which are resilient, and which mean that irrespective of what's happening, we're still able to continue and plan for the future. And it touches on what Pamela said about free trade agreements. We do need to make sure the free trade agreements are thinking about the future in mind, not just what we're doing today, which is why we're having chapters on digital trade, as Director General mentioned. But Pamela's also right that an agreement is still just an agreement. And the way I describe it in the UK is that free trade agreements are like the motorway. It's a road that you're building, but on its own, it's nothing. It's the cars going back and forth that are the critical thing. If they're not using the road, then there's no point in having it. There's no point in having an agreement if we don't have exports and investment. And we don't talk about investment enough, which is the point I wanted to bring in as we wrap up, because investment is also very much about the future. Much of the systems that we've set up are about physical goods, very 20th century tariffs and so on. But we also now need to think about the digital services and also investments. It's all linked together. None of these things are isolated. Investment creates growth. The growth creates the jobs encourages people to be able to export. That creates profit, and when people see profit, they want to invest more, and all of it is linked together. So we must make sure that when we're thinking about the future, it's all of these items together and not just separately in isolation. And I think then we'll get where we need to. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. And then the final word goes to you, Deputy Director General.
Thank you, the man. Thank you, Ambassador. There's a very recent UN Women UNDESA study. I'm sure that you all know about that. Very recent, that says that it may take up to 300 years to achieve full gender equality. 300 years. How many future generations are fitting there, Minister? So we need to speed up progress, and I think that's why this Congress is a very concrete example on how to approach the research community, the policymakers community, to propose solutions, to anticipate risks, to propose policy solutions, and to move from advocating for rights to actually ensuring rights, from discussing whether or not women should participate in this or that, to actually make sure that they participate, that they are equally represented, etc. For that, we need your research, we need your ideas, we need the policy solutions that come out of this fora. And from an international organization perspective, and following my colleagues, we really welcome that and can't wait to the results and the outcomes of this Congress. And I thank you again, WTO, my fellow panel members. It's been a pleasure being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that brings our high-level opening session to a close. And the collective message we heard today was clear that women constitute an economic force globally and contribute to countries' development. Before we end, I would like you to join me in thanking our really exceptional panel for sharing their thoughts, ideas, and insights with us with a round of applause. Thank you. And I'd like to wish all participants in this first World Trade Congress in Gender a fruitful 3 days of engagement, and congratulate you all for your work to find policy solutions that could be put in place for a better targeted and gender responsive recovery, and policies. Immediately following this session, the first plenary will start covering women in crisis from diagnostics to solutions, and I'd encourage you all to remain in the room for that discussion. So thank you again to our wonderful panel for their time, and this session is now closed.